Subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and extraneous materials for the record, subject to the length limitation in the rules. This hearing right now, I had the pleasure of meeting with our guest and talk about some of the issues beforehand. This is an area that is extremely important in light of what is going on in the world. And counterterrorism is something that has a lot of different opinions, solutions, and what have you, but this is one which is not going to go away. And I am delighted that we have our guests with us. And right now, I don't see anyone else, and I'm not going to chastise the ranking member for taking his time getting down here, but I know he's my very, very good friend, Representative Keating from the great state of Massachusetts, who I was just in your district, and where I spent some time with my family, and it was absolutely great. So I'm going to turn to the ranking member for 5 minutes for an opening comment.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for coming and spending money in my district. And it's always a pleasure to team up with you, as we have on many issues, and will continue to do in the future. And for Chairman Poe and yourself and myself, this is an important hearing on a very important subject. So I'd like to thank you. I'd like to thank the Chairman for holding this hearing. And I'd also like to thank Ambassador Sales for joining us today. And once again, I had the pleasure to do this the other day, extend my congratulations on your appointment to this position. And I look forward to working with you on U.S. counterterrorism policy and how we can be more effective in addressing what is truly a global threat. Terrorist attacks we've witnessed take innocent lives and wreak havoc in communities, not just domestically, but around the world. And they underscore how critical the issue is for promoting greater security for us here at home and for our families around the world because of these great and challenging threats. It's widely understood that the fight against terrorism is not solely taking place on battlefields. Violent extremism incubates where individuals are denied access to justice and an opportunity to provide for their own families' basic needs. It spreads when we do not dismantle terrorist financing networks, or when governments turn a blind eye to terrorism, even as it undermines their own legitimacy and ability to guarantee security for their own people. It grows when conflicts emerge, humanitarian crises unfold, or new governments struggle to establish the institutions that are necessary to bring their countries through what are often turbulent transitions. This is why the State Department is so critical to our security and combating terrorism. Terrorism is a global threat and requires coordination with our allies and partners throughout the entire world. We cannot shut down terrorist financing networks, support new democratic governments, stimulate investment and economic growth, track foreign fighters, and train law enforcement and counterterrorism units on securing our communities by ourselves. Yet these and so many other steps are necessary, and if we want to live in a world where we do not have to wake up daily to new developments in the fight against terror, we'll have to address these issues. And our diplomats, foreign service officers, and countless individuals serving their country at the State Department make our partnerships and cooperation with other countries possible. State Department funding provides the relief, training, and investment that is critical for generating the stability and security needed for eradicating the threat of terrorism. This funding comes with the expertise of the entire department of individuals who understand the local contexts and leaders and geopolitical issues to different conflicts, and who are best positioned to make sure when the money is being spent to combat terrorism, it's being spent in ways that further American security as well. That's why I was joined by so many of my colleagues in our disappointment with the President's State Department budget, cutting nearly a third of the department's budget at a time when we face numerous complex security challenges throughout what is an increasingly more dangerous world. Today, we're here to address the counterterrorism aspects of the budget request, and I look forward to hearing from you on your priorities and plans for using critical human and funding resources available through the State Department and partner agencies across the U.S. government. If we fail to really use diplomacy and strategic investments in promoting stability, we will be mired in conflict and the threat of terrorism for decades to come. So thank you again, Ambassador Sales. I look forward to hearing your testimony, and thank you for being here and taking the time to meet this week. I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Keating. Before I introduce our witness, I just want to explain why what's going on here. Right now, we've got multiple hearings, and there's one over in the House Committee and there's one in Judiciary, which have a lot of attention going on. Besides that, votes and everything like that. So I want to apologize for the three-ring circus that you're part of. And sometimes you come in here, it's very, very busy. Sometimes you feel like the Lone Ranger, no pun intended. But I am personally delighted to have you here, particularly after our conversation. And I am, rest assured, you're going to do a great job. So without objection, the witness's prepared statement would be made part of the record. I ask that the witness keep your presentation to no more than 5 minutes. Hopefully we're going to have other members that'll join us here because this subject is so important. So right now I want to introduce the ambassador. Ambassador Sales is the coordinator for counterterrorism at the State Department. Ambassador Sales was previously a law professor at Syracuse University of Law, and before that, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the Department of Homeland Security. And he's from, as I said, Syracuse in the Northeast, where I had occasion to spend some time. And I hope he's thawed out since those experiences after leaving California. So Ambassador Sales, once again, it is our honor to have you here, and please give your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Keating, and members of the subcommittee. It's a wonderful opportunity to discuss the CT.
Excuse me, do you have your microphone on? Or?
Yes, I do. Closer. Point. All right. Chairman Cook, Ranking Member Keating, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to discuss the Counterterrorism Bureau's work and our efforts to keep America safe. I've been on the job about 3 weeks now, and I'm grateful for the chance to speak with you so early in my tenure at the State Department. Since 9/11, the United States has been the world's counterterrorism leader. We've invested a great deal of blood and treasure in taking the fight to our enemies. CT will always remain a top American priority, and we emphatically state that we will not retreat from our global leadership role. But it's time for the rest of the world to step up too. Our friends and allies must share more of the burdens, financial and otherwise. We need them to make the same commitments that we've made to fight terrorism around the globe. Now, sometimes that means military action, but it's just as important to confront terrorism with civilian tools. The administration's goal is to degrade the terrorism threat to a level where it can be addressed with civilian mechanisms like law enforcement, diplomatic engagement, and capacity building, measures where the CT Bureau has long played a central role. In our fiscal year 2018 request, we've prioritized 3 programs: the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund, the Anti-Terrorism Assistance Program, and the Terrorist Interdiction Program. Let me quickly run through a few of our most important diplomatic efforts and programmatic efforts. First, the protection of soft targets. Terrorists increasingly are attacking soft targets like hotels, resorts, and cultural sites. We've seen the trend in Barcelona, Berlin, London, Manchester, and Nice. And here at home as well, in places like Orlando and San Bernardino. To counter this growing threat, CT has spent the past year working with our international partners through the Global Counterterrorism Forum to develop a set of international good practices on the protection of soft targets. We hope to finalize these recommendations and announce them publicly in the very near future. Second, information sharing. It's essential that we share counterterrorism information, especially at international borders. Working with our international partners here at home, the State Department has concluded bilateral agreements under HSPD 6 for sharing information about known and suspected terrorists. Since 2007, 65 countries around the world, representing all corners of the earth, have signed HSPD 6 agreements. That includes all 38 members of the Visa Waiver Program. When fully implemented, these agreements will help us identify, track, and prevent the travel of those who would do us harm. Third, aviation security. ISIS, al-Qaeda, and other terrorist groups continue to prioritize attacks on commercial aviation. Look no further than last year's attack on Dallo Airlines or the recently thwarted plot in Australia. Along with DHS, the CT Bureau is working to elevate the baseline of global aviation security and ensure that our foreign partners can respond to these deadly threats. Fourth and finally, capacity building. The CT Bureau uses the foreign assistance funds that Congress appropriates to improve our partners' counterterrorism capabilities. We're helping them help themselves. In particular, we assist in building their ability to investigate, prosecute, and adjudicate terrorism-related cases. To investigate, we provide training, equipment, and mentoring to law enforcement. To prosecute, we teach lawyers how to prepare persuasive, well-developed cases that will lead to convictions. And to adjudicate, we work with judges so they have a better understanding of the complexities and challenges of deciding terrorism cases. In my written testimony, you'll see examples where these efforts are yielding concrete and tangible results. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, the terrorist threat is constantly evolving, and along with our friends and partners around the world, we too must evolve to meet that threat. We greatly appreciate Congress's support in this shared endeavor. I look forward to your questions and to our discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. You're going to have quite a job on your hands, and this is one I don't envy your situation, and I support the ranking member's concerned about funding. I think this is something that we cannot ignore. If we don't fund some of your activities or what have you, all we're going to be doing is funding more, as Secretary Mattis talked about, more guns, more money, you know, that's going to be the end result. So some of the programs that you're involved with. My question basically is, how are you going to constantly reprioritize? And, you know, this is like, what day of the week is it? What has happened recently? And, of course, we're approaching the anniversary of 9/11. And it's like, okay, what's the biggest terrorist threat that we're facing? And by the way, as an aside, your comments about working with our allies and everybody on the same sheet of music in a common goal, I think is laudatory, and very, very happy that you're saying that. So in regards to all the threats, and I won't even list them, you know them better than I do, how are you constantly going to reevaluate on a almost a daily, weekly basis, what is the greatest threat facing the United States and Americans?
It's an important question, Congressman, and an important challenge that we have to meet. The terrorist threat is, as you say, constantly changing, constantly evolving, constantly adapting. Our enemies are capable of learning from their mistakes. They're capable of learning from our successes. And a good example of this is the rise of what you might call self-directed terrorism. The al-Qaeda model of carrying out terrorist attacks is one where you have a centralized, hierarchical command and control structure that issues orders to operatives to go out and carry out attacks. It provides them with training, it provides them with resources, it provides them with marching orders. What we've seen in recent years is coexisting with that earlier model of terrorism, a model of terrorism in which individual terrorists are responsible for selecting targets on their own. They don't necessarily require detailed instructions or even any instructions from a centralized command structure. They are self-directed and capable of striking independently. And that rise of that model of terrorism is one that we've seen here in the United States, in San Bernardino, in Orlando. We've seen it increasingly in Europe as well. And so the challenge is to adapt our capabilities to meet that threat. That has to be based on an analysis of the problem. It has to be informed by intelligence reporting about what our adversaries are doing and what their plans are and how they're adapting. And it has to be informed as well by our diplomatic engagement with allies around the world to understand the problems that they're experiencing in their countries.
Thank you for your answer. Before I turn it over to my colleague here, I just want to, I know you've been on the job 3 weeks, but I think the people on this committee are very, very interested in your activities. Don't be afraid to keep us in the loop. We got a lot of things going on, but everything is so important. And I think your efforts and your education can go a long ways to produce allies in this battle that you have. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to the ranking member, Congressman Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And not only as a ranking member of this committee, I'm also on the subcommittee on Homeland Security, on counterterrorism, as well as aviation safety. So the issues you spoke to are longstanding concerns of mine. One of the things as we traveled around looking at different airports through Europe and even in Africa, we were looking at resources that our country was offering to certain countries. And we found in that trip that other countries were reluctant to even take advantage of our resources. But I think given the string of terrorist attacks in Europe in particular, we've seen a change of mind. Are you seeing that change in receptiveness to our resources and our help?
I certainly am, Congressman. I think you mentioned Europe in particular. I think leaders in Europe are very well aware of the severity of the threat that they face. And I think atrocities like we've seen in Barcelona and London and Manchester, and the list goes on, have really galvanized leaders at the national level and at the EU level as well to work internally together within Europe, and to work as part of our transatlantic alliance with the United States to counter this threat together.
Yeah, one of the areas of concern was in Istanbul, and the airport there. There's such a huge, mecca of travel, and I think that there was a reluctance there. But there's been a lot of discussion about improvements in that regard. What have you seen in that area?
Turkey has made a number of important strides. As you know, and as you just said, that the Istanbul airport has been an important transit point, not just for tourists and business people, but also for foreign terrorist fighters who are seeking to enter the conflict zone in Syria and Iraq. I think when the ISIS scourge started sweeping across the Middle East for the first time in 2014, we saw 20,000, 30,000 foreign fighters traveling into the war zone through a number of routes, but including through our NATO ally, Turkey. Since then, Turkey has begun to take a number of strong steps to gain better control of its border with Syria, to stanch the flow of foreign fighters in. Turkey has also stepped up the sharing of information with other NATO allies to give a heads up about the possible movements of foreign terrorist fighters. We've still got some work to do, but I'm encouraged by the direction things are heading.
Yeah, we've had success with our coalition, military success on the ground with ISIS. However, ISIS is different. It's sort of like a franchise that's been described before, as opposed to an entity, because they deal in ideology. And they'll go anywhere, and they'll be receptive to activities throughout the whole world. And that's including not just the Middle East, but areas, Southeast Asia, Central Asia. You see it in the Philippines. I even had discussions just recently about concerns with countries like Bangladesh, where there's the incubation I talked about. All those characteristics are there. And how people that are firsthand in terms of their information have described changes that have occurred. So with that as a given, it brings us back to the importance of USAID and other initiatives that we have, because if indeed they're this franchise that local people on the ground, given fertile territory to exist and grow, will take advantage of, if we're not countering that, we're not going to be successful in stemming this, because it's a moving target. And all those moving targets are over the world, but they could be a threat back here in the United States for all the reasons you described, in terms of air traffic and in terms of people using the social media just to become inspired, and they don't even have to be directed to act. So I'll get back to the cuts that were there. I honestly feel, although your reference to other partners stepping up to the plate, I think they're understanding the need of that more than they did even a few years ago. But for the taxpayer, the best bang for the dollar in dealing with terrorism is to deal with these issues, because it is spread throughout the world. It's metastasized. So how do you get around that, honestly? I know that we're talking about this in our committee. I don't think there's been a full committee hearing where we haven't, right across the aisle, spoke to this need, as well as understand that even the filling of State Department positions are so critical in that regard. I think I'm speaking for the vast majority of the full committee, both sides of the aisle. This is something we see as a major need, and just want to get your reaction to this. I know that you're constrained with budgets, but this is about your budget. In a rare instance, Congress offered more money, and it's not getting used for some of these things. So if you could just address that.
Certainly.
I know you're brand new. So that's
Certainly. Well, thank you for the question, Congressman. It's a very important question. You're right. ISIS is a franchise. They're branching out all over the world, not just in their core heartland of Syria and Iraq. We see affiliates in Afghanistan. We see them in the Philippines. We see them all across the globe. In every place that ISIS is, we need to be as well. We need to have a presence to counter their false narrative. We need to have a presence to build up the capabilities of the countries that are now finding themselves with us in the front lines of the fight against ISIS. And we're doing that at the CT Bureau. Where ISIS is active, we are committed to expending the resources that the American taxpayers have entrusted us with to counter this threat. You mentioned Bangladesh in your question, and so let me just address that country in particular. Just last year in 2016, we funded crisis response forces in Bangladesh, and last year they were very successful in carrying out a raid against suspected terrorists at a safe house in an apartment building. The CT Bureau funded officials managed to arrest one of the terrorists. Several others were killed in a gun battle. The CT funded officials found 13 hand grenades, 5 kilograms of explosives, 20 detonators, and additional bomb-making equipment. So the Bangladeshis are safer because of the work that our Bureau did, and ultimately the American people are safer because of the work that this Bureau did in helping take down that terrorist cell.
all right. I think, Mr. Chairman, might have time, given the conflicts that people had today, to have a second round of questioning. So I'll yield back, and maybe we'll entertain a second round. Thank you.
Thank you. We are joined by Congresswoman Torres, and I hope she has some questions for us to do. And turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and good afternoon. I think it's afternoon, Ambassador Sales. I would really like to bring it back to our communities, this conversation. I represent San Bernardino County. I've lost constituents in that attack that took place 2 years ago. It'll be 2 years in December. As a former 911 dispatcher, I understand very well how key it is for our first responders, our police departments, to have a very close working relationship with our communities. How can, how, what is the role of community policing in the Bureau, in the Bureau's law enforcement assistant program?
Well, I couldn't agree more with the premise of your question, Congresswoman. We need, at the Counterterrorism Bureau and at the State Department generally, to engage all levels of government, not just foreign ministers and other cabinet secretaries, but also law enforcement officials, community activists, civil society organizations, municipal authorities, the sort of people who are on the front lines of the struggle against ISIS and al-Qaeda. And I think we've been successful at doing that. Recently, we launched an initiative known as the Strong Cities Network, which is designed to accomplish exactly this vision that we're talking about, where we partner with local governments, municipal governments, including law enforcement authorities, to better protect their communities and the nation as a whole.
Right. One of a concern that I have is that I don't think that our cops in the street are getting a lot of information or proper training on how to identify and how to deal. There are some grants that are unattainable for small municipalities, and I think that we need to focus more in the homeland in ensuring that our first responders have that information and have data and are able to work together, with our alphabet soup at the federal level. One thing that I am very proud of is that prior to that 6 months before that incident happened, I was able to actually bring together Homeland Security, the FBI, ATF, at a gathering with our local police departments and sheriffs. So the first time that they met was not when this incident happened. They had previously met, they had exchanged business cards, phone numbers, and therefore I think that call when that incident happened to the FBI office, it wasn't a cold call. They had a contact there, and my concern is I just don't think that we are doing enough to share information and to properly train our cops in the street on how to deal with counterterrorism issues.
Well, thank you for that concern, Congresswoman. I can tell you that I'm encouraged to hear about the institution building that you helped facilitate in your district. That's the very sort of thing that we at the CT Bureau are trying to do on the international stage. Here at home, we take a back seat to domestic entities like DHS and FBI who have the lead in building those relationships among domestic law enforcement players and municipal authorities. But we have the exact same vision when it comes to community engagement on the international stage, working with exactly the same sorts of entities.
Thank you so much. Yield back.
Congressman Keating, you had another question?
Well, another region, and it's really hard to, because it's becoming so widespread to pick out any, but another area of concern I've had too in terms of foreign fighter travel and radicalization is in the Balkans too. And it's becoming an increasing concern there. Could you just share, your views on how things are going, what we could do to improve that specific area? And it's one of those areas, I think, where there's a difference in how the U.S. is perceived. And I guess as a secondary question, it's really important if we want cooperation as to how our country is viewed by the people, not just their leaders themselves. So what's being done on that secondary level, and more specifically, what's your views of what's going on with the Balkans?
Congressman, the Balkans are a very important focus and priority area for the CT Bureau. The Balkans have the geographic fortuity of sort of lying right in the pathway of some of the migration routes into Iraq and Syria. And just as troublingly, they're right in the migration routes for people who, are, having gained battlefield experience, are returning home to Europe, perhaps to carry out more attacks like we saw in the Paris attacks and the Brussels attacks. We're very active with government authorities in the Balkans. programs. The CT Bureau has funded a number of law enforcement training initiatives, and we've worked with the Justice Department funding resident legal advisors. Those efforts are paying, I think, very real dividends. Since we made the Balkans a priority, I believe 131 people have been convicted of crimes related to the movement of foreign terrorist fighters. And my understanding is that there's about 33 more who are currently under indictment and going through the criminal process right now, all of them in Kosovo. So the criminal law is a very powerful tool for deterring terrorist activity, including terrorist travel, and we're doing our utmost to use that tool in the Balkans.
Yeah, and just on the secondary part of that, the way the U.S. is perceived in some of these areas is a concern. Areas where I think we were much more viewed much more in a supportive way. That's not quite the case now for a number of reasons. And I guess if you could comment too, one of Russia's objectives overall in the world is to create a schism between Western allies. Have you seen any of their efforts as part of their engagement in elections there, as they did in France, as they're trying to do in Germany, and as they're doing throughout the area, as well as the propaganda that they have so successfully, engineered to try and split our coalition apart? Is that creating a problem too?
Well, Congressman, I think our transatlantic alliance is strong and durable, and it's built on shared history and, even more importantly, shared values. NATO, of course, is the bedrock of our security regime, security posture, and it's the bedrock of the post-war international system. I think it's unshakable. And I think you're seeing not just the United States, but our European allies redouble their commitments to NATO, not just to deal with traditional adversaries, but also to focus on new threats that we face, like counterterrorism. And as you know, NATO has recently announced the appointment of a counterterrorism coordinator and the development of new counterterrorism capabilities. I find that very encouraging, that NATO is adapting in the same way that the global threat environment is adapting.
No, they were quite anxious to, get involved in that area. Just a quick question, finally, is the committee's had hearings before on the role of women engaging in counterterrorist activities for a number of reasons. Number one, they are the center point of the families that are involved, and they can spot radicalization perhaps sooner than other members. And when we put resources in the hands of many of the women, they go more directly to the hands of helping children and helping education and things that really buffer us from radicalization. Is that going to be a priority with you?
Yes, it will, Congressman. And I say that, I answer that question as the father of two young girls. So I have some skin in this game, as it were. Absolutely. Women are often frontline targets of terrorists. You think of the atrocities committed against girls by Boko Haram and countless other examples that readily come to mind. So women and girls are important assets assets in the struggle against terrorism, not just potential targets for terrorism, not just potential victims of terrorist depredations. So I think it's important to engage all levels of society, all members of society in this mutual fight.
Great. I yield back.
Thank you. Congresswoman Torres, do you have any more? You do? First of all, I want to thank you very, very much, but to the committee, I know we had, wait a minute, excuse me. I notice we have one more member that snuck in here very quietly, and I want to give the opportunity for Congressman Zeldin to ask him some questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for hosting this hearing, and to the Ambassador, good luck. I look forward to working with you. I think it's great that you're starting to reach out individually to different members to build relationships, and I think that's great to hear all of our different concerns. You have an important job ahead of you, and I wish you the best for all my constituents' safety and security, for this country's safety and security. I've had something interesting happen to me a couple of times over the course of the last month and a half, right before the August recess. I was at a dinner offsite with some members of a foreign affairs committee of a parliament in the Middle East. And we asked them about battling this radicalization that exists in their countries. And one person at the table said something that would be very politically incorrect to say here in the United States. And when that person said it, everyone at the table agreed. And the person said we need to, in their country, they said we need to take them out of the mosques. Gave me a lot to think about. Coming back from August recess, I just had an ambassador in my office from another country from the Middle East. And I shared that reflection and that moment that happened. And I asked him and his staff what he thought about it. And he said it was true. I'd be really interested to hear what your perspective is. I know this is a tough question. It's a really important issue. And it's one that we have in many respects struggled with here because we want to protect America's national security. And I think we, in many respects, we're always trying to say and do the right thing. Fascinating perspective that I got from two different countries in the Middle East, both Muslims who were sharing this perspective, both saying that we should take them out of the mosques. What's your thought of that?
Well, I think, Congressman, you've raised a very important issue, which is how do we address the threat not just of violence, but of the radicalism that ultimately culminates in violence. And at the CT Bureau, we've partnered with a number of important partners and allies around the world to address this very issue, to engage in a systematic counter-radicalization campaign that can offer opportunities to young people to divert them away from a path towards radicalization, to offer off-ramps such that people who might have been inclined to embrace violence see alternatives to that course, to more fully integrate all members of society into the economic opportunities that can help dissuade them from pursuing violence. But it's not just enough for us to address the risk of violence. That's merely the tip of the iceberg. What we are engaged in is a fundamental contest of ideas. And there's an ideological component to this struggle as well, in much the same way that there was an ideological component to the Cold War. We have to engage our adversaries at the level of ideas and demonstrate why their false claims are indeed false. And in so doing, it's important for us to partner with authentic voices of Islam around the world who likewise reject the siren song of radicalism and violence.
Here in the United States and the international community, we view places of worship and schools and hospitals as protected sites that are respected, that are off limits, that are sacred. And it seems like it's pretty obvious, I guess at this point, that some of what we hold dear and sacred institutions to us in the United States might not be getting used in the same way that we aspire to for our own children and others here in the United States. So with Israel, when they face issues with Hezbollah storing missiles inside of protected religious sites, or I hear this story about taking kids out of mosques, or kids learning with textbooks that are teaching them a version of history that grooms them to be adversarial to good people. These are all challenges that you face. I wish you the best. I thank again the chairman for hosting this hearing. And please continue to work on building that relationship with each and every one of us.
I certainly will. Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador, I want to thank you very much. And And I appreciate the members showing up here and asking their questions. You've been on the job 3 weeks. Speaking on behalf of the committee, I think we got to have you back again. Obviously, today was somewhat of an anomaly, but it's, it's a crazy place. But I think about funding, about supplemental requests for funding, this is a very bipartisan committee. And I think a lot of people, both Democrats and Republicans, realize how important your job is. So I would ask the staff's indulgence in the future to, let's do this again, I think in a number of months where we are not jammed with, votes, hearings on some very important issues and this and that, because what you have to say, I think, is extremely important. And we can perhaps help you in lending support for a cry for more money for the important work you do. So I want to thank you very, very much. And at this time, this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.